In a way, North Korea is selling its children to the Russians. It's a worrying development. For global security perspective, what is hugely worrying is what on earth is Kim Jong Un getting out of this? What are the North Koreans getting out of it? Because to sell, in effect, 30,000 of your souls to Putin would think that there's a pretty high price. And I expect it's something around the nuclear area. First of all, it's very clear that the Russians are desperate for manpower, any sort of manpower. A few weeks ago, they passed the 1 million mark, 1 million casualties in this 3-year war. When you consider Britain lost 340,000 casualties in total for the Second World War, it really puts it into perspective. And we understand for the latest UK MOD update that the Russians are still losing 1,000 people a day on the front line. And we know that Putin is trying to open up new fronts in the Sumy area and Kharkiv area. Anywhere he can get manpower from, of great concern, I think, to us here in Europe in particular, is what North Korea is getting in return. And it would seem, certainly if the rumours are true and some relatively good open source intelligence, that actually the Russians are giving the North Koreans some nuclear know-how. We know that Kim Jong Un is desperate for a nuclear weapon of some capability. They've been trying for a while. We know they've got missiles, which they fire frequently into the Japanese Sea and over Japan. But they, as yet, we don't think that they've got a suitable warhead they can put on top of it. But that's perhaps where the Russians come in. We understand that they might have what we call an atomic warhead, which are the very first type of weapons designed and the sort of weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what they will be trying to do is to get a much more powerful weapon and warhead. Actually, the technology to do that, they probably don't have. The technology to put the warhead on the missile, they probably don't have. But this is what the Russians most certainly have. It's what we suspected they might have been doing with the Iranians, but in not so much detail. But again, the Iranians gave some drones and missiles to Russia. But North Korea is given its own flesh and blood, and Kim Jong Un seems content that 11,000 of them have been killed or wounded, but he's throwing another 30,000 into the meat grinder. And these are, a few of them perform well, we understand, but actually, there's a huge language problem between the North Koreans and the Russians really use them like some sort of medieval cannon fodder or even some of the dreadful battles we saw in the First World War, like Passchendaele, where soldiers were slaughtered in their thousands. That is what happened to the North Koreans, and that looks like what's going to happen again now. And that is why we must assume that the Russians are giving nuclear technology to enable North Korea to become a nuclear pariah state and in the Far East. And that must be hugely worrying for the countries in that region. We've been very focused on Iran and what they've been up to, but actually North Korea are a bit further along. We think they have uranium enriched to 95%, which is what you need to be able to create a nuclear chain reaction and an explosion. What can be done is very difficult to say. The Americans certainly don't seem to be about to bomb into obliteration the North Korean nuclear weapons program as they have done the Iranian one. And the converse, we only learned yesterday that the Americans are stopping military aid, support, hardware, ammunition to Ukraine, which seems to be an extraordinary move. I think when it comes to Europe, when you couple in what we've seen coming from North Korea, all these additional troops, America pulling back from support to Ukraine, we in Europe have really got to step up to the mark here. Well, I think North Korea is pretty totally isolated anyway, except for Russia. They seem to be the only people who will deal with them. It will be a huge concern to South Korea. It brings an additional dynamic. Of course, there are 50 to 60,000 American troops in South Korea. So that really brings America directly into it. And as we've seen with President Trump's withdrawal of support to Ukraine, he seems far more focused and concerned about, firstly, the Middle East, but primarily the Far East. That appears to be where his focus is. Hitherto, we have always thought he's looked much more closely at China and seen China as the greater threat. But most immediately, it's North Korea. one respects the Chinese leadership have been fairly rational. However, Kim Jong Un is, a despot dictator who is probably not rational. People might forget that he had his uncle or his step uncle, Kim Jong Nam, murdered with the deadly nerve agent VX in Kuala Lumpur airport a few years ago. So I think that irrationality is a huge concern, that he might try and actually use this weapon. And he's frequently fired missiles in Japan's direction. Japan, again, a very close ally of the US too. So it's a worrying development, and one has to assume that American intelligence will be all over this. One cannot trust somebody like Kim Jong Un, and he, and with his affiliation with Russia, he would appear to be getting stronger and stronger. So I find it strange that the Americans have not really flexed their muscles in this particular area. And it's something that, fine, if the Americans are going to focus on that, then that is probably good news. But it just reiterates that we in Europe must focus on Ukraine to ensure that Putin goes no further west than he's gone at the moment.
Проходило тактическое занятие у северокорейских войск, которые здесь нам помогают, которые обучаются в Курской области. И вот сейчас мы видим, как большие группы ребята возвращаются с задачи. Задача была рассредоточиться в лесу и отрабатывать свои квадраты. Вы видите, что уже и экипировка, снаряжение, хорошо владеют оружием, уже привыкли к нему, пристроились к тому оружию, которое выдавали. Давайте я вам покажу. Вот, конечно, такими большими группами в жизни во время штурма они передвигаются мало, в основном это небольшие группы по 2-3 человека, 4 человека. Основное, к чему привыкали северокорейские бойцы, это к тому, что условия современной войны – это дроны, это коптеры и это передвижение малыми тактическими группами. Сегодня эта тактика освоена, что в дальнейшем даст северокорейским бойцам, конечно, безусловно, фору перед другими армиями азиатского региона. Безусловно, когда ребята вернутся, они будут обучать свою армию, и действительно в этот момент эта армия станет одной из самых боеспособных армий в Азиатско-Тихоокеанском регионе.
I think everybody has been amazed by the Ukraine Secret Service capabilities, their attacks deep into Russia, and also, of course, the Israeli and US intelligence on the ground in Iran. One hopes and assumes there might be something similar in North Korea, but that might be challenging because it is a really difficult place to operate in. We shall see. I think the key thing will be is when these North Korean troops land at the front, and whether this time Putin is going to deploy them into Ukraine, which he didn't the last time. But I think people just need to understand 30,000 souls coming from North Korea. I mean, you can't imagine Britain giving 30,000 souls to Ukraine or to use on the front line without our control.